Alright, Chapter 2, Railway Track Gauge. Introduction. Gauge is defined as the minimum distance between two rails. The Indian Railway follows its standard practices in the gauge measured by the clear minimum distance between the running faces of the two rails shown in Figure 2.1. It shows your gauge in between your rails and your sleeper. The European countries, the gauge is measured between the interface of the two rails at the point of 14 millimeters below the top of the rail. This chapter describes different gauge with prevalent in India and other countries. It also discusses the problem and implications of multiple gauge systems as adopted in India. Alright, gauges of the world railways. Various gauges adopted of the different railways of the world due to the historical and other consideration. British Railway, the gauge was 1,525 millimeters, or 5 feet, was initially adapted to the wheel flanges at the time of the outside rails. Subsequently, in order to guide the wheels better, flanges were made inside the rails. The gauge then became 1,435 millimeters, or 4 foot 8.5 inches. At the time of the width of the rail, the top of the 45 millimeters was topped 45 millimeters. The 1,435 millimeter gauge became the standard gauge for most European railways. The approximate portion of the varied gauge of the world railways are given in Table 2. Your typical standard gauge is 1432, 4 foot 8.5 inches, 62 total percent of length. England, U.S., Canada, and Turkey, Persia, and China. Alright, that means that's your 56.5 inch gauge is your standard gauge in England, U.S., Canada, Turkey, and Persia, and China. Your broad gauge of 5 foot 6.5 inches, Indian, Pakistan, Selenian, Brazil, and Argentina. Broad gauge of 5 foot, Russia and Finland. Cape gauge of 3 foot and 6 inches, Africa, Japan, Java, Australia, New Zealand. Meter gauge 3 foot and 3.5 inches, India, France, Switzerland, Argentina. And different gauges, 23 different various other different gauges, in various other countries. Alright, different gauge for the Indian Railways. East Indian Company intended to adopt the standard gauge of 1435 millimeters in the Indian. Also, the proposal, however, was a change with Mr. Simon W. Simons, consulting engineer, government of the India, recommended the wire gauge of 16 or 5 foot 6.5 inches. The core director of the East Indian Company decided to adopt Mr. Simons' recommendation of 5 foot 6.5 inches. Finally, become the Indian standard gauge in 1871. The government in India wanted to construct cheaper railways for the development of the country at a 1,000 meter gauge was introduced, and due to the course of two more gauges of the width of the 762 millimeters, or 2 foot 6 inches, or 610 millimeters, 2 foot, was introduced and for thinly populated inner mountain railways and other miscellaneous purposes. The detail of the various gauges existing in Indian railways are given in Table 2.2. Your broad gauge is the BG as a 5 foot 6.5 inch feet. Your meter gauge is 3 foot 3.37 of an inch. Narrow gauge or 1,000 millimeters. Your narrow gauge is 2 foot 6 inches. 2 for 3. Choice for the gauge. The choice for the gauge limited to as each of the country fixed the gauge. All new railway lines constructed adhere with the standard gauge. However, the following factors theoretically influencing the choice of the gauge. Cost and consideration. The only marginal increase for the cost of the track of the wire gauge is adopted in this connection. The following points are important. The proportional increase for the cost of acquisition land, earthwork with the rail, for the sleeper, than be above with other items with constructing the wire gauge. The cost of the building bridge, the converge tunnels increase not only marginally due to the wire gauge. The cost of the construction station built with the platform, staff quarters, level of the crossing signals associated with the highway network is more less than the same of all the gauges. All the cost of the rolling stock independent gauge with the track of the carrying the same volume traffic. Traffic consideration. Volume of the traffic depends on the size of the wagon, speeding and hauling, the capacity of the train. The wired gauge can rarely carry larger wagons and coaches and theoretically carry more traffic. The wider gauge has greater potential for higher speed because of the speed function of the diameter of the wheel, which is determined limited with the width of the gauge. The type of the traction signal equipment is required for the independent of the gauge. Physical feature for the country: the impossible to adopt steeper gradient for the sharper the curve of the narrow gauge is compared with the wider gauge. Uniformity of the gauge. The existing of the uniformity gauge for the country is enabled to smooth and steady and efficient operation for the train. Therefore, a single gauge should be adopted irrespectively, with a minor advantage of the wider gauge and few limitations in the narrow gauge. The 2-4 problems caused by change of the gas. The need uniformity of the gauge for the recognized all the advanced countries of the world. A number of problems have cropped up with the operation of the Indian railways because of the use of the 3 gauge, for the ill effect of the change of the gauge, more popular known as the break of the gauge, and numerous, and some of these come enumerated here. All right, inconvenience passengers. Due to the change of the passenger having to change for the trains at the mid-journey, along with the luggage and with the causing inconvenience such as the following: climbing stairs and crossing bridges, finding seats in the compartment, later trains, missing connection with the later trains in case the earlier train is late, harassment caused by the porters, transportation of luggage, uncertainty, delay in the reaching of the destination, difficulty in train shipments for the goods and transshipped at this point where the train for the gauge takes place for this cause of the following problem: the damage to goods that they do in the transshipment, the considerable delay with the receipt of the good of the transportation, theft mechanism, theft and misplacement of the goods during the transshipment, the subsequent claims, non-availability, adequate specialized trade and shipment, labor and staff, particularly during these strikes. Insufficient use of the rolling stock. As wagons have move at empty in the direction of the train shipment point, they are not fully utilized. Similarly, the ideal wagon for one gauge cannot be moved on another gauge. Hindrance of the fast move of the good of passenger train. Due to the change of the gauge for the traffic, they cannot move faster, which becomes the major problem with the particularly with the duties of the emerging, such as wars, floods, and accidents. Accidental facilities in the station yards costly sheds additional facilities needed to be provided with the handling and large volume of the good train shipment points. The duplicate equipment of the facilities such as yards and platforms need to be provided with both gauge and train shipment points. Difficulty balancing economic growth. The difference of the gauges also lead unbalanced economic growth, which happens because of the industry sets up with a meter gauge or a narrow gauge station cannot send their goods economically efficiently to areas with being serviced by a broad gauge station. Difficulties in future gauge conversion projects. Gauge conversions are quickly difficult and requires enormous efforts to widen existing track with the widening of the gauge involved the track with heavy civil engineering work such as widening of the embankments, bridges, and tunnels, as well as the tracks. Additional with the wider rolling stock is also required during the gauge conversion period that they are operational problems are as well with the traffic that has been slowed down even to suspend a certain period in order to execute the work. 2.5 Uni-gauge policy of the Indian Railway. The process caused the multiple gauge states in the system of the country that has been discussed in the previous section. Multiple gauge sections not only the cost and cumbersome, but also serious the bottlenecks in the operation of the railways and hindered the balanced development of the country. Indian Railway therefore had to be built. The discussion in 1992 of the getting rid of the multiple gauge system following the uniform policy of the adopting the broader gauge is 1676 millimeters uniformity. 251 benefits of adopting the broader gauge 1676 millimeters uniform gauge. The unigauge will be highly beneficial for the railway administrator as well with the nation as described below. No transportation bottleneck. There will be no transport bottleneck for the uniform gauge as adopted with the lead of the improvement of the efficiency resulting from the fast movement of the goods and passengers. No transshipment hazards. There will be no hazard transshipment as such as the delay, no damage to the goods, no inconvenience passenger transfers from one train to another. The provision for the alternate routes. Uniform gauge and policy with the alternate routes will be available to free move of the traffic that will be less pressure with the existing broader gauge network. The expected the result long haul road traffic reverting the railways. Better turnaround. There will be better turnaround wag of the locomotive. They will improve the operating ratio rail system as well as a whole was the result of the company with the benefited immensely. Improved utilization of track. There will be an improved utilization of track, reduction of the operating expense for the roadway, balance economy, growth of the railway. The areas presently reserved to the meter gauge will receive the additional fill-up, leading them to remove the regional disparity of the balance of economic growth. No multiple tracking work. The unigauge project will attempt to need the certain traffic facilities. Multiple tracking works which offset the cost of the gauge for the conversion to the certain extent. Better transfer and structure. Some areas that are served by the meter gauge have the potential to becoming the highly industrialized skilled manpower. They also available. The unigauge policy will help them provide that there's better transportation infrastructure. Boosting investor confidence. The liberation of the economical policy with the unigauge protect for the Indian Railways that have come to play with a significant role will help the boosting of the investors' confidence for the goods being distributed throughout the country in the time without any hindrance. This will also help with the setting up the industries in areas that are not yet exploited because of the lack of the infrastructure facility. 252. Planning of the Unigauge project. The gauge conversion program has been accelerated in Indian Railways in 1992. The 8 plan 1993 to 1997 in itself placed progress achieved with the gauge conversion from the project of 5 years with more than total of the progress made in the last 45 years. The progress of the gauge conversion projects then briefly given in Table 3. Alright, shows your year, your progressive conversion kilometers, and remarks. All right, your loading gauge represents the maximum width and height which with the rolling stock of the namely locomotive, the coach and wagon that can be built up load. Sometimes the load gauge, but also used for the testing of loaded empty vehicles as per the maximum moving dimensions prescribed and the function with the Indian Railway. The maximum height of the width of the rolling stock is prescribed in the per the load gauges given in Table 2.4. Your broad gauge is 13 maximum height of the rolling stock 13 foot 7 inches, maximum width of the rolling stock 10 foot 8 inches, meter gauge 11 foot 4 inches, maximum height of the rolling stock 9 foot rolling stock width. In order to ensure the wagons are not overloaded with the physical barrier that made with the construction structure of the set profile leading gauge with the structure considered the vertical post of the armament and from the steel arc that is suspended from the top of the function of the structure that ensure the top of the and the width of the most portion of the load will clear the structure such that the bridges, tunnels, etc. as along the route. Show the horizontal post is steep of the arc, the rail level, and the rails. The loading gauge. 2.7. The construction gauge. The construction gauge is decided with the additional adding the necessary clearance with the loading with the gauge. The vehicle can be safely as prescribed speed without any of the infringement of various specific structures, railway lines, such as the bridges, tunnels, and platform sheds are built in the corner of the construction with the construction gauge so that the side and the top of the remain with the loading gauge. Summary: there are three top of the track gauges that have been adopted by the Indian Railways. The basic consideration behind the adoption of the meter gauge and narrow gauge was to provide access to undeveloped areas with low cost for construction. The multiple gauge system has been problems had caused many problems causing serious bottlenecks in the operation of the railway. The work gauge for the conversion has been accelerated in Indian Railway since 1992. The unit gauge will be highly beneficial to the railway user, the railway administrator, and the nation. All right, review questions. We're not going to go there, and then we're going to go on to 3, alignment with the railway lines.